Have you ever stood in a cheering crowd, not for a great football match, but to witness a still beating human heart being held up to the sun? Imagine it. The air is thick with the scent of copal and the pungent scent of fresh blood. The leopard skin drum beats as fast as your own heartbeat. And at the top of the Great Pyramid, the Templo Mayor, a life is about to be offered to the gods. This is not a horror movie. This is the reality of the Aztec Empire, a royal ritual where death is not an end, but a beginning that keeps the universe going. For them, human life is not measured in gold or silver, but in the existence of the sun. And the emperor, the head of the empire, is responsible for fulfilling this bloody contract with the creators. They believe that if they did not, the sun would stop rising, eternal darkness would engulf the world, and humanity would be plunged into extinction. The story begins at the very root of Aztec cosmology. They believed that the world had gone through four creations and destructions, corresponding to four suns. The first sun was eaten by a jaguar, the second by a hurricane, the third by a rain of fire, and the fourth by a great flood. The world we live in is the world of the fifth sun. It was born not from omnipotence, but from a great sacrifice. The gods gathered in the sacred city of Teotihuacan, wondering who would be brave enough to jump into the sacrificial fire to become the new sun. Finally, the humble god Nanahuatzin braved the plunge, followed by the proud god Texiztecatl. Together, they became the sun and the moon. But there was one problem. The sun did not move. It stood still in the sky, burning everything. In order for the sun to have the energy to move, the other gods had to sacrifice themselves, offering their blood and hearts to create the rotation of the universe. From this creation myth, an unshakable truth was inculcated in the Aztec mind. Life requires death. If the gods had to sacrifice to create the world, then humans who benefited from that sacrifice owed a sacred blood debt. Blood, calciwatal, precious water, and heart, toned to sunstones, were no longer mere body parts. They were fuel for the gods, the energy that gave Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, the strength to fight the forces of darkness every night, only to rise again in the morning. To stop sacrificing would be to abandon one's guardian deity, to extinguish the sun with one's own hands. And no event more clearly demonstrates this cosmic burden than royal ceremonies. When Atilatoni, emperor, ascended the throne, he not only received the crown, but also shouldered the responsibility of being the nurturer of the gods. His coronation was marked by large-scale sacrifices, often of prisoners captured in the battles known as the Flower Wars. Cochiatl. These were wars waged not to conquer land, but to harvest flowers, the bravest warriors from rival city-states, the most worthy offerings to the gods. Their deaths atop the pyramids were not seen as acts of brutality, but as glorious transformations. The victims were seen as messengers, carrying messages and human energy to the divine realm. For the Aztecs, this was not mass murder. It was cosmic crisis management at its highest level. What is brutal to us was deeply religious to them, a deadly logic for sustaining life. But the question is, why the heart? Why would a brilliant civilization with incredible architecture, astronomy, and art base its entire belief system on such a terrible act? The question that hangs over the top of the bloody pyramids is, why the heart? Why would a civilization that could precisely calculate the cycles of the celestial bodies and build spectacular floating cities base its faith on such gruesome death? To decipher this, we must take off our modern lenses and try to think like the ancients. For them, the universe was not a mindless machine, but a giant living organism operating on one core principle: reciprocity. The gods shed blood to create humans, so humans must shed blood to feed the gods. It is not cruelty, but a cosmic contract, an endless cycle of energy. Let's step back from the Aztecs and look to their elite neighbors, the Maya. Long before the Aztecs rose, the Maya were practicing blood rituals. But there was one crucial difference. They started with themselves. Mayan kings and queens performed painful bloodletting rituals, piercing their tongues, ears, or other sensitive parts with stingray spines or obsidian knives, letting their precious royal blood drip onto sheets of paper made from tree bark and burning them. The smoke from the burning paper carried their life essence up into the sky, becoming food for the gods. This act revealed a profound truth. The obligation to shed blood was not reserved for enemies or commoners. It began with the most powerful. The king was not the one who ordered the sacrifice. He was the first to suffer, the first to offer, to demonstrate his sacred connection and responsibility to the spirit world. Once we understand that even the blood of an emperor is a commodity, we begin to understand the logic behind the sacrifice of prisoners. It was not hatred, but choice. They did not choose the weak and the sick. They desired the fiercest warriors, the most courageous leaders from the rival city-states. Why? Because in their thinking, the heart was the seat of will, courage, and life force, Teolia. Blood is the river that carries that energy. A great warrior's heart contains a more abundant source of divine energy than hundreds of ordinary people's hearts. Therefore, sacrificing a warrior is not killing an enemy, but harvesting the strongest, most quintessential energy to send to the gods, ensuring a quality meal. This is where the reverse thinking comes in. We, with our modern, individualistic worldview, see every life as absolute. We look at the ceremony and see a murder. But the Aztecs and Mayans looked at it and saw a transformation. The victim was not dead in the way we understand it. He was being elevated to a higher plane, becoming part of the divine, an immortal messenger. His death had a cosmic purpose, a glory that earthly life could never bring. Records show that captured warriors even considered being sacrificed a noble death, a shortcut to the warrior's paradise, where they would accompany the sun god on his daily journey. What is terrible to us is a privilege to them. It is not barbarism, but a completely different value system, a world where the survival of the community and the universe is placed above the survival of the individual. This use death to serve a higher purpose mentality was built on a very strict logic in their worldview. But was this logic unique to the New World? Or in the barren deserts across the ocean, another great civilization had also buried a mass of living people with their dead king, not to feed the gods in the sky, but to ensure that the king's power and service continued in the afterlife? Let us leave America and cross the ocean to the land of the pharaohs, where the death of another became a ticket for a royal soul. We have crossed the ocean away from the fiery pyramids of the Americas to a desert where a different conception of eternity is built of stone and blood. Welcome to ancient Egypt. Here, death rituals were not performed openly under the sun to feed the gods. They were performed in the solemn silence of underground tombs, not to keep the universe running, but to ensure that a single man, the divine pharaoh, could continue his reign in the afterlife. At the dawn of Egyptian civilization, during the First Dynasty, some 5,000 years ago, when a pharaoh died, he did not die alone. Archaeologists at the holy site of Abydos have unearthed royal tomb complexes that have astounded the world. At the center is the magnificent tomb of the king, such as Pharaoh Jur or Pharaoh Aha. But surrounding it, like loyal satellites, are dozens, even hundreds of smaller tombs arranged in perfect order. Inside these subsidiary tombs are not gold and silver treasures, but the remains of those who served the pharaoh during his lifetime. His courtiers, his servants, his best soldiers, his concubines in the harem, and even the king's beloved hunting dogs. Archaeological analysis shows that all these people were buried at the same time, right after the pharaoh's funeral. This was no coincidence. It was a deliberate ritual called a retainer sacrifice. The logic behind it was both cold and pragmatic in a very Egyptian way. The pharaoh was not just a king. He was a living god, an incarnation of Horus. When he died, he would be transformed into Osiris, the king of the underworld. A king, no matter what realm, needed a court. Who would pour his cup? Who would guard his eternal sleep? Who would keep him company in the eternal kingdom? The answer was grim. The same people who had done it for him on earth. Their deaths were the guarantee of the pharaoh's royal immortality. His power was so absolute that it extended beyond the veil of death, claiming ownership not only of the lives but also of the souls of his subjects. This was a reversal of the Aztec way of thinking. The Aztec sacrificial victim became a messenger to the gods, a transformation of cosmic proportions. The Egyptian servant, on the other hand, died to remain a servant. His status was tied to the pharaoh, even in eternity. He did not feed the gods, he served a god. The question is, were they willing? Egyptologists still debate. Many of the skeletons show no signs of violence, leading to the theory of a mass ritual suicide, possibly by poison. Imagine a scene both dramatic and macabre. After the pharaoh's body is placed in the tomb, a procession of the most elite members of the kingdom, dressed in their finest clothing, quietly enter the tombs that have been dug for them. They take a dose of poison, lie down, and wait for death to come so they can continue their journey with their master. Was this the ultimate honor or an unavoidable duty? Either way, it reveals a society where the value of the individual is completely overshadowed by the role and power of the king. However, this practice of large-scale human sacrifice did not last long. By the Second Dynasty, it began to wane and eventually disappeared altogether. Perhaps the later pharaohs realized that burying a generation of skilled craftsmen, talented officials, and skilled soldiers was an irreparable waste of national resources. They found a much more clever and effective alternative: Ushabti statues. These humanoid figurines, inscribed with magical incantations from the Book of the Dead, were believed to come to life and perform all the tasks for the deceased in the afterlife. A magical alternative to real human sacrifice, a symbolic one. But as these direct sacrifices faded into the past in Egypt, did their ghost really disappear? Or did it simply morph, go into hiding for thousands of years, only to reappear in a new guise on another continent? In medieval Europe, people no longer buried servants with the king, but they were willing to burn those considered witches or heretics at the stake in the name of faith and royal power. The specter of human sacrifice did not vanish in the Egyptian desert. It merely changed its clothes, crossed the Mediterranean, and took on the cloak of piety in medieval Europe. Here, in a world ruled by crosses and crowns, people no longer openly sacrifice themselves to polytheistic gods. But if we look deeper, beyond the surface of religious doctrine, we find that the psychological and political mechanisms behind taking a human life in the service of a larger purpose are still present, even more powerful. It just has a new name: purges of heresy. Imagine a crowded square in a medieval European city. In the center is not a stone altar, but a wooden pyre stacked high. The person tied to it is not a prisoner of war, but a man or woman accused of being a heretic or a witch. The crowd is not cheering for the sun god. They are chanting prayers or shouting in a mixture of fear and glee. And the person ordering this execution, either directly or indirectly, is usually the king or some royally backed figure in the person of defender of the faith. Is this a simple punishment? Or is it a re-engineered form of human sacrifice? The counterintuitive thinking here is to see these public executions not as mere justice, but as ritual. The victims were not merely killed. They were sacrificed for the safety and purity of the Christian community. In the medieval worldview, a heretic was not simply someone with false beliefs. He was a spiritual pathogen, a malignant tumor that could spread and destroy the body of Christ, that is, the entire society. A witch was not simply a practitioner of folk magic. He was an agent of Satan, a breach in the spiritual defenses of the kingdom. Therefore, their destruction was not an act of revenge, but a necessary surgery, a cleansing. The painful death of a person on the stake was believed to purify the community, appease God's wrath, and restore divine order. And this ritual was closely linked to royal power. A medieval king ruled by divine right. The stability of his kingdom depended not only on his army and treasury, but also on God's favor. By publicly and brutally eliminating those deemed hostile to the faith, the king was making a dramatic show of power. He demonstrated to his people that he was a pious ruler, protecting them from supernatural forces and chaos. At the same time, he was sending a message to God himself that he was worthy of his throne. Each fire in the square not only burned a body, it also strengthened the foundations of power for the king and the church. The sacrificial victim became a scapegoat, taking on the sins and anxieties of society, and their deaths brought a sense of security and order back. Consider the ritual. Execution was never a quick, private affair. It was a public spectacle. There was a parade of the victim through the streets, a priest's sermon explaining their sins, and a crowd of people. Fire, in particular, was seen as a cleansing element. It not only destroyed the body, but was also believed to eradicate spiritual impurity. This logic, though dressed in a different theological garment, bore striking similarities to that of the Aztecs. The death of an individual was justified by the good of the collective, by the preservation of the cosmic, or divine, order. The difference was that, instead of feeding the gods, they were trying to purge evil. But if in Europe, human sacrifice transformed into a tool of ideological purification to consolidate religious and royal power, in another great empire in the East, it returned to a more primitive and direct form. A form close to ancient Egypt, but with a very unique scale and philosophy. Let us go to China, where the emperors not only wanted servants in the afterlife, but also wanted to bring a large army and harem into the ground through a cruel custom called sacrificial burial. From the purgatory pyres of medieval Europe, we continue our journey eastward to ancient China, where the specter of human sacrifice no longer hides behind complex theological arguments, but emerges naked, massive, and brutal. Here, people practiced a custom called xiantang, xingzong, burying the living with the dead. It bears some resemblance to the ritual of the Egyptian pharaohs, but was pushed to a more gruesome level, not only to serve, but also to demonstrate power and protect secrets. It raises a chilling question. Why would an emperor need to bury hundreds of people alive with him? The practice of martyrdom dates back to ancient times, especially during the Shang and Zhou dynasties. But some of the most shocking archaeological evidence comes from the tomb of Duke Jing of Qin, a king of the spring and autumn period. When archaeologists excavated his tomb, they found the remains of 186 people buried with him. They were not buried haphazardly. They were carefully arranged, some curled up in separate coffins, others packed into sacrificial pits. Who were they? Concubines, soldiers, servants, people whose lives were destined to end with their masters. However, the pinnacle of cruelty and paranoia probably belongs to Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor to unify China. We often know him through the majestic terracotta army, a symbol of using objects to replace real people. But that is only half the story. According to the historian Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian, after Qin Shi Huang died, his son Qin Ershi issued a terrible edict. All the concubines of the former emperor who had no children were ordered to be buried with him. This number could be up to hundreds of people. Not stopping there, in order to protect the secrets of the structure and treasures inside the mausoleum, all the craftsmen who built it were tricked and locked inside, the exit sealed. They were buried alive along with the great work they had created. This action presents us with a terrifying counterintuition. The terracotta army may have been a substitute for soldiers, but sacrificial flesh and blood humans served other purposes that terracotta statues could not. First, there was the belief in an afterlife bureaucracy. Like the Egyptian pharaoh, the Chinese emperor believed that he would continue to rule in the afterlife and needed a full court, complete with concubines and servants. A martyr's burial was the most direct way to expressly send that bureaucracy to the afterlife. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the funeral was a political tool, a display of absolute power for the living. Burying hundreds of people, including those of high status, sent a clear message to the noble families and potential aspirants to the throne. The power of our royal family is absolute. It can decide life and death. Do not even think of challenging my successor. It stifled potential rebellion through psychological terror. Ultimately, it was a strategy of ruthless elimination. Forcing the childless concubines to die along with him prevented them or their families from exerting political influence in a new court. Killing off the Masons ensured the absolute security of the tomb. In this case, The sacrifice was not just a religious act, but also a carefully calculated political move, where human lives became pawns to protect the legacy and safety of the royal family. This gruesome burial practice shows how far the power of the emperor could reach, turning the lives of others into personal property to carry with him. But the idea of treating people as objects to be sacrificed for power was not limited to great empires. Here at home, in the kingdoms of Southeast Asia, a less talked about truth existed, where the lives of slaves were used as scapegoats for the construction and stability of the monarchy. From the vast mausoleums of China, where the emperors carried their entire court underground, we move south to the ancient kingdoms of Southeast Asia. Here, another, more obscure and less talked about practice reveals a form of human sacrifice that was closely linked to monarchical power. It was not done to feed the gods in the heavens, nor to serve a king in the afterlife. Rather, it was done to suppress the earth itself, transforming the murdered souls into eternal guardians of royal structures. Imagine a king who wants to build a new capital, an impregnable fortress, or a sturdy bridge. According to popular belief throughout the region, the land is inhabited by spirits, local deities. Construction will disturb them, and if not appeased, the project will be plagued by constant disasters. Walls will collapse, disease will spread, and bad luck will haunt the kingdom. To solve this problem, an extreme solution was born, sacrificing a living person right at the construction site. It was believed that an unjust, painful death would bind the victim's soul to that location, turning them into a gnat or ghost, a powerful guardian spirit. In Burma, Myanmar, this belief is known as Maya-sade. Legends say that when building large cities like Mandalay, people were buried alive under the four corners of the walls and main gates. The victims, after a violent death, would become a Maya-sade gnat, a guardian deity with a grudge against invaders. Their souls, trapped between two worlds, were said to be extremely ferocious, creating a spiritual barrier that protected the entire city. A pillar in a palace, a bridge pier across a river, all important structures of the country could be consecrated by a living being. So who were these unfortunate victims? Rarely were they people of status. They were often prisoners of war, criminals, and especially slaves. In the social structure of the time, slaves were considered property, their lives at the disposal of their masters. This revealed a cruel reality. The security and strength of the kingdom, symbolized by its architecture, was literally built on the blood of the lowest class. The king's power was demonstrated not only by his ability to build great structures, but also by his ability to take the lives of the weakest as scapegoats for those structures. This is where reverse thinking gives us a different perspective. We admire ancient citadels and palaces as architectural relics and symbols of a glorious era. But to the people of that time, they could also be monuments of horror. Every brick, every stone could be associated with a macabre story. The belief system of earth spirits provided the perfect excuse, a divine justification for a brutal act of murder. It transformed the crime into a civic duty for the national good. Folk tales of children being kidnapped and buried under bridges are not just fairy tales. They reflect a real fear in the social subconscious, a fear that development and sustainability always come at a price in blood. From the Americas to Africa, from Europe to Asia, human sacrifices, whether to feed gods, serve kings, or protect buildings, have one thing in common. They are performed in the name of a higher good. But is there really a sacred source of energy that is released when a heart stops beating? Or is it all just a perfectly orchestrated and elaborate power play? Modern science, from archaeology to social psychology, can help us lift the veil on this mystery to answer the core question. Is human sacrifice a religious act, or the ultimate tool for crowd control and power consolidation? We have traveled through civilizations, witnessed blood spilled on the pyramids, in the tombs of pharaohs, on the pyres of Europe, and under the foundations of Asian citadels. All were done in the name of a noble purpose: to nourish the universe, to serve the supreme being, or to protect the kingdom. But now it is time for modern science to speak up to decipher the core question. Is there a sacred energy released from these deaths, or is it all just a naked instrument of power? The answer from the scientific perspective is clear and unequivocal. There is no evidence that human sacrifice generates any kind of divine energy. There is no law of physics or biology that suggests that the heart of a brave warrior can power the sun. This notion of spiritual energy is a belief system, an ideological software, not an objective reality. So if it is not about sacred energy, why has this practice persisted and been so widespread in so many unrelated cultures? The answer lies in its social and political function. Human sacrifice, when stripped down, is the ultimate tool for crowd control and power consolidation. Let's start with the most important function, consolidating the power of the elite. Whether it was an Aztec Teletoni, an Egyptian pharaoh, or a European king, performing a public sacrifice was the ultimate declaration of power. It sent a message. We, the rulers, have the power to decide life and death. We are the only ones who can communicate with the gods, and we are indispensable to your survival. By staging these dramatic and terrifying plays, the elites placed themselves at the center of the universe, becoming indispensable intermediaries between the human world and the divine world. Their power no longer came from the army, but from the gods themselves. Second, it was a powerful tool of social control. Humans have always feared chaos, fear of crop failure, fear of natural disasters, fear of war, fear of death. Sacrificial rituals provided a sedative to that fear. They created an illusion of control. By performing a concrete, tangible act, sacrificing a human life, people felt they were actively doing something to resist fate, to bribe the gods. Moreover, these public ceremonies created an intense collective emotional experience. The mixture of fear, awe, and religious sublimity bound the community together. It redirected internal tensions, social conflicts, outward onto the scapegoat. All shared a common enemy, the wrath of the gods, and a common solution, the death of the victim, creating a temporary but powerful solidarity. Finally, from an anthropological perspective, large-scale sacrifices are a costly signal. When the Aztecs sacrificed thousands of prisoners to inaugurate a temple, they were not just feeding the god Huitzilopochtli. They were sending a message to neighboring city-states. Look, our empire is so powerful and wealthy that it can waste thousands of human lives without any harm. It was a form of psychological warfare, a threat more terrifying than any military parade. It demonstrated that a state was capable of mobilizing resources and violence on an unimaginable scale. So science has demystified human sacrifice. It is not a purely spiritual act. It is a social technology. The belief in divine energy is the perfect cover for a calculated political core. The real energy released is not cosmic energy, but political energy, the energy that strengthens the throne of kings, strikes terror into enemies, and binds people to a predetermined social order. But this raises a more troubling question. If the core psychological mechanism is sacrificing a few for the safety and power of the many, have we in the modern world truly escaped it? Or has it simply transformed once again, lurking in our society, in our political decisions, and in the very psychology of sacrificing living people for power? The question that modern science leaves us with is disturbing. Have we really escaped the mentality of offering lives for power? The answer, perhaps, will require us to look back at the world we live in. The stone altars have been destroyed, the obsidian knives have been consigned to museums, but the psychological altar, where the lives of some are placed on the altar for the benefit of others, seems to still exist, only it has become more invisible and more subtle. Take the veneer off modern language. When leaders wage war in the name of national security or the highest good, what are they doing? They are asking young soldiers, citizens, to sacrifice their lives. These soldiers are hailed as heroes. Their sacrifices are celebrated. Their deaths are seen as necessary for the continuation of the nation. How is this logic any different than the Aztec warriors' glory in dying on an altar to keep the sun rising? Both are personal sacrifices to a larger abstraction determined by the ruling elite. The victims have changed, the reasons have changed, but the mechanism of sacrifice for the good of the collective, or at least the good of the decision makers, remains. Look at our economy. The concept of sacrifice zones is increasingly being talked about. These are communities, often poor and vulnerable, that bear the brunt of the environmental damage from toxic factories and industrial zones. They breathe polluted air, drink contaminated water. Their health and lives are silently sacrificed so that the rest of society can enjoy cheap goods, abundant energy, and economic growth. They are modern-day slaves buried beneath the foundations of prosperity, faceless scapegoats for the god of progress. And perhaps the most common form of modern sacrifice is the creation of a political scapegoat. When a society faces a crisis, an economic downturn, social unrest, a pandemic, the easiest way for a leader to consolidate power is to point the finger at a particular group of people and blame them for everything. It could be immigrants, an ethnic minority, or a political opposition. This group is portrayed as a threat, a taint that must be eliminated to cleanse the nation. Attacking, marginalizing, or depriving them of their rights becomes a communal ritual that directs the anger and fear of the crowd toward a specific target, allowing those in power to escape responsibility. This is precisely the logic behind burning a heretic alive to restore order. The upside here is to realize that our progress may be just a veneer. We condemn the barbarism of the ancients, but are blind to our own abstract forms of sacrifice. The biggest difference is probably scale and distance. An Aztec king looked his victim straight in the eye. Today, sacrifice decisions are made in opulent boardrooms through statistics and policy documents. The consequences affect thousands, millions of people the decision makers never meet. The indifference is masked by bureaucracy. The altar of sacrifice is no longer made of stone, but of bulletins, speeches, and policies. The victim is no longer held by four men, but by invisible systems. The ultimate question is not whether they sacrifice people, but whether we are participating in them without knowing it. Our journey through bloody histories and complex belief systems comes to an end. We have begun with a beating heart in the Aztec sun, entered the eternal silence of Egyptian tombs, felt the heat of purification pyres in Europe, and witnessed the staggering scale of Chinese burial practices. We have also listened to the whispers of spirits trapped beneath the foundations of Southeast Asia. Throughout our journey, we have seen a common denominator, a red thread that connects these seemingly unrelated acts. It is the human effort to impose order, a sense of meaning on a chaotic and terrifying universe. Whether it is to feed the gods, to ensure the eternal life of kings, or to purify the community, a person's death is always cloaked in the cloak of a higher purpose. Science has helped us peel back that sacred veneer, revealing a cleverly disguised mechanism of power, a technology of social control. But perhaps it is too easy to judge our ancestors as barbarians or ignorant. What is more difficult, and more important, is to look at them and understand them. To understand that behind the most horrific rituals were very human motives. The fear of death and extinction, the belief in an unseen world, and a fierce desire to leave a mark, to overcome oblivion. History, after all, is not a story of monsters, but a story of human beings, with all their complexities, contradictions, capacities for greatness and horror. Looking back at the sacrificial altars is not to obsess over the past, but to reflect on the present. To realize that the old instincts of scapegoating and sacrificing the interests of others for one's own ends still lurk somewhere in the human psyche. And perhaps the greatest lesson these stories leave behind is a reminder to be vigilant, to be wary of any ideology that demands human sacrifice in the name of an abstract cause, no matter how noble and sacred it may seem.